So here's today's big idea. Without data, you are podcast guessing, not podcast guesting. You see, 9 years ago when we started, there wasn't data. It was a lot of guessing. But now, with the ever increasing data, you can make better decisions. You can make better targeting to get better results. And that's why I'm so excited for you to listen to this great conversation between Trent Anderson over at Podchaser and Christina Marcello, who actually came over to us when we assumed Connect. Now, pay particular attention to the idea of a framework. And I'd ask you, do you have a framework in picking podcasts? If you don't, then it's probably a lot more guessing. There's no strategy to it. And I love Trent's idea of focusing on content, context, audience, and reach. I'm sure you're going to get a lot out of this interview, and I look forward to talking with you about my takeaways at the end. Here's over to Christina.
Thanks, Tom. I am so excited to be here with Trent Anderson. Trent, some listeners might already know this, but Trent and I are former colleagues, so I really think today is going to be a pretty fun episode. And Trent, I'm really excited to dive in with you. Before we get too deep into things, could you give me a little bit of information about who you are and what experience you have with podcast data?
Awesome. Well, it's always great to talk with you, Christina. I've always enjoyed chopping it up about all things podcasts with you. So I'm Trent. I'm the head of RevOps at Podchaser. Podchaser is the intelligence engine for the podcast industry. So I've got a lot of thoughts, a lot of information about podcast data and how folks are leveraging that to find the right guests for their shows and find the right shows for their guests. So excited to get into the convo.
Podcast data, as it pertains to Podchaser, what does that mean? When we say podcast data, I mean, we could be looking at a myriad of things. What kind of information can somebody gain by using a platform like Podchaser?
We collect data across 4 different distinct planes, if you will. So the first is contact information for every podcast. So long story short, we have verified publishers we work with that are inputting their own proper email addresses for certain shows or networks of shows. We also have different means of collecting that information through kind of self-reported contact info. We've got over 40,000 claimed podcasts on the Podchaser platform, which is great. We also take a look at audience demographic data, and we collect that in a couple of different ways. Might have seen a recent announcement about us releasing our predictive demographic data. And that's all thanks to our hardcore engineering team, shout out CQR, for figuring out how to model language that's happening on podcasts and being able to predict, based on the topics, based on the language, etc., what kind of demographics are we looking at for the show. So that's been rolled out, and it's currently at 500,000 podcasts, and that'll continue to grow as the model continues to get smarter. So really excited about that. We also collect data through pulling in a social graph for podcasts, and we do that through YouTube, Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook. And through that, we're able to triangulate demographic data to supplement the predictive demographics. We're able to look at psychographic data in some cases, as well as geographic. So if you were looking for, let's say, a target audience that were mostly salespeople that were working in major metro areas that had interests in technology, that sort of thing, that's some of the filters you'd be able to use within Podchaser. So that's on the audience side. The third thing that we look at is reach data. So we've got partnerships with a lot of the podcast player apps, as well as hosting providers, of course, our parent company being Acast. And through that, we're able to predict and model out what the reach estimates look like for all the shows in our database. And then the fourth thing that we look at is brand sponsor data. And with brand sponsor data, we're using transcripts to assess, both from an AI ML as well as a human verification process, who's sponsoring these shows, how long have they been sponsoring them for, and what's the likely spend that they've been putting forth to be a part of that audience. So yeah, contact information, audience demographics, reach, and then brand sponsor data is what we look at from the Podchaser side of things.
So pretty deep dive there in terms of the information that you're able to access. It's not just what percentage of the podcast landscape your podcast or a podcast falls in, really some niche information and insights into how these podcasts are performing and who is sponsoring them as well. So if I'm a brand or I am a thought leader and I'm looking to leverage this information for a marketing purpose, how would you, Trent Anderson, go ahead and leverage that data to have an effective campaign?
We've got this 4-step framework that you are intimately familiar with, Christina, from our time together, but we call it content, context, audience, and reach. So content, we're looking for shows that are discussing topics or subjects that are relevant or germane to your brand promise or your thought leader's experience or point of view. Context, we're looking to unpack what kind of perspective these shows have on said content. So we'd be looking at some of the episodes that they've had before. Are they discussing a certain subject matter? Are they doing it with a certain point of view or a certain stance? And we always gave the example in healthcare, right? We worked with quite a few pharmaceutical companies, and they wanted to get in front of moms and family types of shows, because typically mothers were making the healthcare decisions on behalf of their family. And as a pharmaceutical brand, of course, you want to reach that audience so you can let them know about some of the, struggles or challenges that are facing, certain health care decisions. So from a content perspective, we'd be looking for mom shows, lifestyle shows, family shows. But contextually, if any of those shows had, let's say, an anti-vaccine stance or a vaccine hesitant stance, contextually, that wouldn't make for a great fit if you're a pharmaceutical brand who's rolling out a new vaccine, right? So that's one way that we're able to kind of triangulate there. The third part of this is audience. Again, we just talked a little bit about how we pull in the audience data across these podcasts. That's really important. And I think one thing to mention as well is many podcasts, and certainly many podcast networks, just don't have access to that data through first party. Sometimes they'll do audience surveys where they're polling their audiences. Hey, what's your age? What's your gender? What's your household income level, et cetera. So in using some of the predictive modeling that we do, as well as some of the social graphs that we pull in, we're able to get really, really granular with that. And then the fourth kind of part of this framework is reach. And reach is something that we had to have many conversations, education and re-education with our clients about. And it's because almost everyone came to us saying, hey, we want to get on the Joe Rogan show. Hey, we want to get on The Daily. Hey, we want to get on NPR. 100%. Absolutely. Would love to work with you and get you on those shows as well. However, what we actually like to describe the podcast ecosystem as almost as a spectrum when it comes to reach. So on one side of the spectrum, you've got highly technical, highly clinical types of shows, typically hosted by a subject matter expert. They might not have massive reach, but the people that they are reaching, their audience, could be the exact right audience for them. Key decision makers, influencers, those that are moving the needle, so to speak, when it comes to making decisions. And of course, on the other side of the spectrum, you've got more of your mass media, pop culture types of shows, usually hosted by a celebrity, an influencer, usually a network-associated show. They could have massive reach, but they're not going to go nearly as deep into some of the finer details of subject matters, right? So, and of course, you got shows in the middle that kind of play both sides of it. And I think one really interesting example of how the spectrum changes over time is somebody like Andrew Huberman. Not a lot of people knew who Huberman was when he first launched his show, and it was obviously a highly technical, highly clinical type of podcast. And, he was PhD at Stanford, and he had a very small group and following, and then kind of moved up the scale. And now he's got the number one, health and wellness podcast in the world. And a lot of that is just to show like how dynamic this industry is. So again, the 4-step framework that we look at in order to identify best fit shows is content, context, audience, and reach. And ever since we started adopting kind of that, we're able to deliver on much better campaigns on behalf of clients as well.
That ties in perfectly with what I was just about to go into, Trent, because our founder here at Interview Valet, Tom, he likes to say, bigger isn't better, more isn't better, better is better. And I think that ties in nicely with the idea of, I think a lot of people get into the podcast space, to your point, and they think, I need to get on Tim Ferriss. I need to be on the Joe Rogan show. Why does content, context, audience, and reach, why does that level of framework work so well? And how what would you say to somebody who is, they hear content, context, audience, and reach, and they say they understand that from a marketing perspective. They understand that, you really want to be where your audience is and maybe not in front of so many people, but they're looking at podcast marketing as really a numbers game and trying to get as many impressions as possible. To somebody who hears content, context, audience, and reach, they're still a little hesitant about it. What would you say to that person?
Yeah, and I think it's probably helpful to take a step back and unpack why we even developed that to begin with. And most of that is because the podcast industry is almost notorious at this point for being siloed in terms of data. And that's because most of the data comes from hosting providers or networks themselves. So as a result, marketers or advertisers have to basically take podcast word for it when they report on their data or metrics. There's been quite a bit of digital ink spilled of late at Podcast Movement most recently with some of these minimum guarantee deals that have been doled out. And basically talent managers are putting these numbers in front of brands, and brands don't have a way to verify that. So they say, okay, so like literally millions of dollars are getting poured into best guess, take our word for it types of things. And a lot of that is because podcast industry is highly fragmented with relatively low net promoter score. What do I mean by that? So you've got 4 key players, your Apple, Amazon, and then Spotify, as well as Google/YouTube, which we can talk a lot about maybe for a different topic of a different day. But each one of them are trying to create their own walled gardens of data. And why would they do that? Of course, to drive advertising revenue higher. So if they are the sole arbiter of the data and the metrics, then effectively they can charge a larger premium for CPM rates or for engaging with brands and sponsors from that perspective. So Podchaser's stance, as well as our parent company Acast, is that in order for the podcast industry to continue to grow, we need to open source that data. And that's exactly what Podchaser does in terms of aggregating data across all of these various platforms and kind of dumping them all into one place. And that's our Podchaser Pro dashboard. So to bring it back to your question about what would I say to a marketer that didn't want to prescribe by the content, context, audience, and reach, I'd say, well, how are you doing it currently? And in having that conversation with, at this point, dozens and dozens and dozens of brands and companies, it's mostly a function of not having the time, the bandwidth, or the know-how in terms of being able to collect all this data. And I think there's been a very big shift in the way that marketing is viewing marketing activities of late. And I think a lot of that is due to pandemic. A lot of it's due to the rise of dark social, dark funnel, where marketers aren't able to log into Google Analytics and see referral source equals podcast guest appearance. Therefore, it never actually gets tracked in any of their metrics, never gets reported to the C-suite. But they know that it's working. And how do they know that it's working, at least for the ones that are doing it well, such as your Refine Labs, and Chris Walker's been absolutely brilliant in the way that he's positioned this to the market at large, is through taking not just a quantitative approach to marketing, but certainly a qualitative approach as well. And how Chris and others have dedicated their time to discussing this is through self-reported attribution. It's through taking a look at hand raisers on high intent landing pages, saying, how did you hear about us? And by and large, for the most impactful kind of places along the buyer's journey, a lot of them are saying podcast. Hey, I listened to episode 67 when you were unpacking how to do the split the funnel analysis with Gaetano Donardi, and it blew my mind, and that's why I'm reaching out to Refine Labs. And so again, I would just say that the content, context, audience, and reach framework, while it certainly isn't gospel, although I believe in it quite a bit, of course, it is a really strong way to be more methodical about your approach to the podcast landscape. Again, because you're not going to be able to capture any of your motion or movement of podcasts through Google Analytics. So again, there's 5 million podcasts out there, and you want to find the best ones for you to make an impact for your business. Deploying the 4-step framework is just going to help you jump the line when it comes to that, and obviously avoid a lot of wasted time and energy.
Yeah, I really appreciate your answer on that. And as I mentioned, we've worked on quite a few campaigns together. Once we rolled out content, context, audience, and reach, not only do you have a better understanding of really who your target audience is, you pretty much just set up a strategy, a campaign strategy in and of itself in terms of what you're looking for and how to be the most effective and efficient in that campaign as well. So I could not agree more. I think content, context, audience, and reach is a really useful tool. What I also wonder is, case studies, right? So we've worked on a few campaigns together, Trent, and we've seen this in real time. When we've seen this work and we've seen this be effective. I can think of a few of our former clients who were on some pretty small shows and really saw a large impact from that. Is that something that you could talk a little bit about?
Yeah, I was hoping you'd ask for real case studies. So we worked with a client in the supplement space, and they had their venture backed. One of their founders was a very notable podcaster himself, which is why they thought that the podcast strategy might be a useful endeavor for them. And we ran multiple campaigns on their behalf, but the one that was most impactful and one that really opened my eyes to like, maybe we're onto something with this content, context, audience, and reach thing is we did kind of an integrated campaign with them. So we were doing guest appearances plus ad spend. And we put forth about 25% of our budget for a really large show in a perfect fit audience with a notable host who's a television actor, TV actor, or a movies actor, very notable individual. Great conversation, great dialogue between our thought leader and the podcast host, really deep dive into the product and what it did and how it was solving for this metabolic crisis that the country's facing. And we thought this is going to perform like gangbusters. And while it did perform pretty well, it was not the most impactful despite being the largest reach show that we placed our client on. The most impactful show that we placed our client on was actually a show that only had about 10,000 monthly listeners. It was started by just one guy who had spent a lot of years in kind of the corporate grind and decided he was going to get fit for the first time. And he was over 50, so he named his podcast the Fit Over 50 Podcast. And he's doing private virtual training on behalf of clients that are all over 50 years old. And when we placed them on that show, there was a little bit of hesitation because, well, it's not a huge show. This guy seems like he's kind of a rural dude. Does it really fit with our brand ethos, etc.? And fortunately, the client did approve it and went through, and almost like instantaneously upon publish, what we saw was the numbers were trending in terms of conversions. And this is an e-commerce company, so we had that kind of back-end attribution we were able to work on. But within like the first 24 hours of that episode going live, it had already doubled the total amount of sales than the big one with the movie star. And what we started to look at even further was this podcast, the smaller podcast, the Fit Over 50 show. They also had a very active and thriving Facebook group. And it was only about 1,600 people within the Facebook group, but there were comments and messages popping off in that, like 90 messages a day. And it was all because it was those audience members, those members of the community from the podcast, all asking really insightful questions about how they're implementing this into their diet, how they're using this to recover from certain things, etc. And as a result, again, this small, quote unquote, small podcast ended up doing about 120x of return compared to the really large notable show. So, you know, they hear a lot of commentary about like the riches are in the niches and some of those kind of overused tropes within marketing jargon, but it really is true. It was brand alignment from both podcasts, but that community aspect, that kind of parasocial relationship that existed between the podcast host of the small show and his thriving community versus a well-known actor and kind of general population. I'll always recommend to clients moving forward that if you have kind of that community aspect that's baked into the podcast, it's going to outperform even some of the biggest shows you could possibly think of. So that was a really eye-opening and enlightening experience, I think, for everybody who worked on the campaign.
I love that story, and I think about it all the time. I come back to community every single time I think about this, and every time I think about podcasting in general. I think that there's sometimes, again, when we think about this big podcast, the big podcasts, the bigger ones, the Tim Ferrisses, etc., there's some authority that comes along with being on a show like that. But truly, these smaller shows do have a dedicated community, right? They feel like they are a part of something, and they are more along the lines, and Trent, this is probably a whole other episode where we talk about audience, community, super consumer, etc. But the smaller podcasts, would you agree, they are more on the community super consumer side of a demographic.
I agree completely, and I think I've heard a couple of different things, like you only need 100 true fans or 1,000 true fans in order to like do something viable in the content creation space, and I think that's incredibly true. And a lot of that is because if you think about a podcast host and then their audience, the host has to have some sort of authority baked in, right? And just by virtue of them being a podcast host, they already have that. They're sitting in the driver's seat, such as you and such as Tom right now. And then they're leaning on their audience to kind of supplement what kind of content that they need. And they're probably listening to the problems, the concerns that their audience has, and then they're creating content around that. So as a result, if you're sitting in that authority seat and you're solving the problems that your audience has and you're creating that one-to-one relationship with all of them, it's incredible how much the audience kind of uses the podcast host as a trust proxy, if you will. And I think that's why you start to see some of these outsized returns, even if it's a small show, because if the host has developed that level of trust with their audience, then you're golden. So yeah, I totally agree with you.
And I think that all comes back to the depth of information that you can get from a product like Podchaser, because does the listenership matter to some degree? There is definitely a case to be made for how many listeners a show has. That being said, you can dive into so many more data points within a product like Podchaser. I know you briefly touched on it a little bit ago, but some exciting news. Again, I was pretty excited to see in Pod News from James Cridlin this morning about the predictive demographics tool. So again, I know you did touch on that a little bit, but seeing as how this is kind of brand new, shiny, exciting, I'm personally a little bit interested in how the predictive analysis comes through.
Yeah, very, very technical jargon. So I'll veer away from some of that. Again, CQR is a lot smarter than me. But really what that is to enable is true audience first targeting within podcasts. So if we can avoid the conversation that starts and ends with reach, right? We want to actually focus on impact. And this is one of the ways that we're able to kind of move the market forward when it comes to impact. And it's something like 44% of all podcast advertising goes towards like the top 100, top 1,000 shows. Pardon my math. It's somewhere along those lines. And what that means is there's a huge gap between the haves and the have-nots, if you will. But as we know, the mid-tail of the podcast industry and the long tail of the podcast industry is actually what makes up the much larger volume of number of shows, listeners, etc. So in order to help, thought leaders, in order to help brand advertisers, etc., really tap into this audience-first approach, this is why we viewed it as such a monumental move for us as a product and for the industry writ large, because we're always going to have the Tim Ferrisses of the world. We're always going to have the Rogans of the world. But the likelihood of anybody actually getting to be part of one of those types of shows is just minuscule. So instead, with what we're doing with predictive demographics, which is part of our larger collections builder process, is really using technology to our benefit and triangulating audiences that are going to be very similar to maybe the Tim Ferriss or Rogans of the world, but doing it at a discount rate, meaning, hey, if we've got this show that has an 80% audience overlap in terms of demographics and interests with Rogan, but they've only got 20% of the listenership that Rogan has, well, it's really the same audience that you're going after. They're talking probably about very similar things, and you can access that same type of audience at a much lower price point or at a much lower attention point. And I think that is really one of the key factors here as well, especially if you're looking at podcasts from an earned media perspective. That interest point, it's a lot easier to get through to a host who is in the weeds, doing all of their own guest booking, managing the whole workflow of their podcast. Because if you bring the right story to the right podcast at the right time, and it's aligned with what the podcast's audience wants and needs from a content perspective, that's when the magic really happens. So again, predictive demographics are just one small step within this, but again, it's really to help tap into the audience first perspective, because again, I liken it to advertising in, airports, right? Like great, I know that these snowflakes and IBMs of the world are putting in these massive installations in airports, and it's getting seen by literally millions of people a day. But is it the right people? Is it the right kind of audience you want to get in front of? Or would it make more sense to deploy spend towards, an industry conference where you're going to get 700 of your peers all in the same gathering place and be able to talk to them there, right? So I think that's kind of the analogy that I'd use, is with predictive demographics and the collections builder, is getting in front of the right people. Now, that's where the process begins, and of course, in the actual pitching process, you got to have the goods when it comes to story and how it's going to benefit the audience. But yeah, it's definitely a fun step forward in our progress.
I was really excited to hear about that because, again, here at Interview Valet, we do take a very similar approach as well in terms of audience first and trying to match audience demographics and just, making sure that we're getting in front of the right people at the right time as well. So I could talk to you forever, Trent, to be quite honest. I've really enjoyed talking with you, and I think we have touched a lot on the importance of data in podcasting so that you can really you can utilize podcast interview marketing with an insight-driven strategy rather than just kind of taking a guess at, I've heard this podcast being talked about around my circle. That podcast might not actually be as popular or as impactful as you may think. So I really appreciate all of the insights that you've been able to share with us today on the show. If somebody were interested in learning more about Podchaser, or they wanted to talk to you, Trent, get to know a little bit more about how they could reach you, if you could share that information, that'd be great.
Yeah, just Trent@podchaser.com. If you have any questions or want to take a whip through the demo, always happy to do that. And as always, I'm on social, so find me on LinkedIn. Good place to find some of my musings and ramblings about the state of the podcast industry and how to make it work for you and your brand.
I will say Trent has a fantastic LinkedIn. So truly, I'm going to shout out the LinkedIn as well. Follow Trent on LinkedIn. Check out Podchaser after this interview or during this interview, but check out Podchaser and see all of the data that you could be utilizing through the Podchaser Pro dashboard. So thank you so much, Trent, for being on the show with me today, and I appreciate you being here.
Thanks, my friend. Always great to talk with you, and we'll see you on the other side.
That was an amazing discussion. But with everything, knowledge is not power. The application of knowledge is power. That's why I always want to wrap it up with, what did I learn? And for me, it was Trent's idea of audience first. I find too many people focus on, I want to be on this podcast. I want to be on this podcast. What audience do you want to talk to? Because there's the idea of reach. I want a bigger reach. No, at the end of the day, you want a bigger impact because that's where the results are coming from. I highly encourage you, if you're not using data in your podcast interview marketing, check out Podchaser Pro. We use it. It's one of the many tools that we use at Interview Valet. If you're not using it, if your team's not using it, if the agency that represents you is not using it, you're really missing out on a lot. It's more the podcast guessing than podcast guesting. Now, at Interview Valet, we are a data-driven company, right? One of the Thomisms is, in God we trust, everyone else bring data, and we share that data. And there's a resource I wanted to share with you. It's called The State of Podcast Interviews. And it's something that we release every year. It's a summary of all of our data that we have gotten from our database. And you can get that. Just go back to podcastinterviewmarketing.com. Look for episode 2 on data, and we'll put the link to that. Also, if you want to see how our system works, right? I wrote it out in a book called Podcast Guest Profits, How to Grow Your Business with a Targeted Interview Strategy. We'll put that there also. You can get a free copy of the book. And, if any of this resonated with you, if you said, wow, I would like to see how I could use podcast interview marketing to grow my brand, to grow my business, we'll also put a link back there so that you can talk with someone on our team. Now, the message that I want to leave you with here comes from Zig Ziglar. It's a great line. He says, if you aim at nothing, you will hit it every time.